Okay, so welcome back everyone. This week we'll be digging into the cognitive views of learning and the objectives for this week. So these are your learning objectives: to be able to differentiate between the behavioral view of education and the cognitive view, understand and recognize the components of information processing theory, to describe the parts of sensory memory, to describe how short-term / working memory works, and then to describe the parts of long-term memory. And so that is going to be a plenty for you to learn for a week. Okay, so as you know, behaviorists, and those are researchers that study behavior, believe that learning was behavior. So this view encompassed what Skinner called the black box, which was the idea that we couldn't see inside anyone else's mind to see their learning, so all we knew were the things that happened outside of it. Because we cannot actually see it, we cannot measure it, and thus cannot study it. Later researchers found, however, that there were many other types of learning, and that was the beginning of the shift to cognitivism. Cognitive researchers take the stance that knowledge and strategies are learned, and once we have learned these, we can make choices about our behavior. In chapter 8, we will focus on information processing theory. Before we do that, we should recognize that there are two broad types of knowledge, general and specific. General allows you to do a lot of different things, and the information or knowledge can transfer from one situation to another. Specific knowledge, however, is for specific topics, subjects, and situations. This is why someone may be a good student with general knowledge and how to study and does well in most of their classes, but they may lack specific knowledge in one particular subject and not do well in that subject. So the examples that I have here, for general knowledge, you can have general knowledge about how to operate a computer, and you can have specific knowledge about how to run Windows 10.0. So that's the difference there. I also tend to think about this a little bit in connection to what we talked about with fluid and crystallized intelligence, if that helps anyone. So, how many of you have ever been curious about how your brain works? Everybody, I hope. And that's good, because I am too. And it would surprise me, actually, if you never wondered why, when you're talking to Aunt Sally, you start thinking about Transformers, or why you can remember Lincoln's birthday but can't remember what you had for breakfast this morning. In this unit, we're going to start answering some of those questions that you have. I can't say we will answer all of them or any of them definitively, but we will start by learning about information processing theory. And so my first question to you is, what is this a picture of? And you should be thinking, it's a computer. It's a computer, and it's kind of an old one at that. Having a tower is a bit old school, right? I bet, though, that most of you have no idea how it works. Or, I'm sorry, I bet most of you do have an idea of how that works. We basically input stuff through the keyboard and or mouse, and then it is processed, and we print it out or store it, or both. Nothing new there, we get that. So basically we have input from this, or this, or this. From there, it goes to the central processing unit, which I picture as this. It really looks more like this. And from there, it gets decoded and stored here. And this is a hard drive, which, if I'm being honest, I still actually picture as this. So now that we have, or know, we have a pretty good idea of how a computer works, we're done. Just kidding. We are talking about information processing theory. So, information processing theory says that the human mind works in the same way a computer does. We have input, processing, and long-term storage. So we have the keyboard, the CPU, and the hard drive. These are described as sensory memory, short-term or working memory, and long-term memory. So information gets put in, it goes to short-term memory, and then to long-term memory. Pretty simple, right? Except, does human memory work exactly like that? And I have to say, it probably doesn't. So to help us think about that, I've arranged for us to go to the beach together, which I think is awfully nice of me. Poor grad student, but I'm going to help you guys out. So here we are at the beach. So is that at all like how you remember the beach being the last time you were there? What is missing? So you don't have heat, you don't have other sounds like you just have the waves, so you don't have anybody's radio. You definitely don't have any olfactory, right? We don't have any sense of smell coming in. So basically, sensory for the human mind goes like this: sound, sight, touch, smell, and taste. For most of us, all five are bringing input constantly and simultaneously. Unless we are asleep or have some sensory disability, what we pay attention to or attenuate to is a product of past experience and learning. So for example, if there was a pineapple on this beach, I would remember the pineapple because I like pineapples. Others of you, former lifeguards perhaps, would count the number of people on the beach, and that's what you would remember. So how is this different than how information is input into a computer? So let's imagine what would happen to a computer if it actually received information the way we do. Okay, this is just too much. So if the computer actually receives the information the way that we do, then the computer crashes. So the human brain might do the same thing, except for we do start to immediately sort and filter. So information processing theory states that there is not enough memory to accommodate all that we perceive. And since reality is always changing, there's probably a fair amount of validity to that. Even in our beach scene, the sun goes behind a cloud, the waves move forward, the wind picks up. All these changes are noted but not stored, at least according to information processing theory. And we should note too that the video is just an imitation of reality and not nearly as complex and ever-changing as actual life. So this stage where we're working with the information is called short-term, but more often people are calling it working memory. Working memory is where information is coded and prepared for storage. So just like in a computer memory, there are subsystems or folders for storage of what we there is storage of what we see, hear, feel, touch, smell, and taste. In the human brain, this is done through the neurons and neurotransmitters, but it is still a transfer of coded information. You should note, information can stay in short-term memory for about 20 to 30 seconds. If it is important enough, it will get transferred to long-term memory. And the final stage in information processing theory is this long-term memory. So, i.e., the holy grail of memory. The Holy Grail, for those of you who may not know, is the cup that the prophet Jesus drank out of the night before he was murdered. It has been missing for centuries, but the search for it has, at least in the Christian tradition, considered to be the highest spiritual pursuit. Despite this, no one's ever found it. Understanding how something is actually put into long-term memory can be a little like searching for the Holy Grail. Where do we start and how do we get there? So my point here is that information placed into long-term memory is very unique, and it's kind of a mysterious group. What gets stored there has been deemed highly important, and this important is relative to experience. Experiences, as you know, are unique to the individual. What we do know, however, is that certain things can enhance the chances of information being stored in long-term memory, such as practice or repetition, and or connecting to other things, which we would refer to as elaboration. So let's go back and look at sensory memory. So again, sensory memory is the first step in information processing theory. Everyone has sensory memory. That is the touch, sight, taste, smell, and hearing. These are working all the time, unless we have some kind of disability. Our sensory memory lasts for about 3 seconds, with visual sensations coded as images and auditory sensations recorded as sound patterns, something like echoes. Perception and attention are critical aspects of this stage. So first, let's take a look at perception. Woolfolk defines perception for us as the process of detecting a stimulus and assigning meaning to it. Perception is constructed from the physical world and our existing knowledge. For example, we know that 2 short lines, one over the other, is an equal sign because our culture has assigned it that meaning. In other cultures, however, it may mean something completely different. So the process of perception is believed to happen in multiple stages. According to cognitivists, perception starts with an analysis of the features of an object into its most simple parts. So they refer to this as bottom-up processing. As perception continues, features are organized into patterns. Incidentally, the study of the process of pattern recognition is called Gestalt, which is German for pattern or configuration. When the actual cognitivists that studied this were from Germany, or the first ones to study it were from Germany. In the next slide, we'll take a brief look at Gestalt. For now, let's move on to the last phase of perception, which is when we combine context and existing knowledge with features and patterns. And cognitivists would call this a top-down processing. And we can say that this all happens quite quickly, of course, with no or little recognition that this is what the mind is doing. All right, so as promised, here are some examples of Gestalt principles, which is another way of saying the rules for pattern recognition. The first example is an example of figure ground. So your mind decides what is figure and what is ground. Some of you will see a vase as a figure and the white as ground, and some of you will see 2 faces as a figure and the ground is black. The second example is proximity. You see these quadrangles as 3 groups because of the proximity of columns 1 and 2, columns 3 and 4, and columns 5 and 6. The third example is similarity. Your mind will group these figures as rows because the shapes and colors of the pink triangles are the same as well as those of the blue objects. So we think about the pink triangles as being the same, therefore we identify them that way. We recognize that pattern. The fourth Gestalt principle is closure. So in this example of the shoe, your mind will fill in the missing lines so that you actually see the shoe even though the lines are not there. So those are some examples of Gestalt principles. As we discussed earlier, if your mind paid attention to every detail and tried to remember it all, most of us would have some kind of major cognitive breakdown. An exception to this might be someone with eidetic or photographic memory who seems to be able to capture all kinds of information visually without effort. Some people with eidetic memory, such as Mary Lou Henner, which some of you may remember her from the TV show Taxi, claim to remember every moment of their lives as an image that they can pull up at will. Instead of snapshots, it seems to be a long running video that they can rewind. In any case, most of us do not have this gift, and so we selectively attend to items or stimuli in our environment. From sensory information, From sensory information, we get information transferred to short-term or working memory. As we discussed earlier, this is similar to the central processing unit of a computer. At this point, information is coded and prepared for storage. Just like computer memory, there are subsystems or folders for storage of what we see, hear, feel, touch, smell, and taste. Again, this is done through neurons and neurotransmitters. Information can stay in short-term memory for about 20 to 30 seconds. Then if it is important enough, it will get transferred to long-term memory. As I pointed out earlier, long-term memory can be seen as somewhat of a holy grail. That is, we may know we want it, or we want to put information in it anyway, but we have no idea how to get there, and it is a little elusive. As you know, right? You just recently took an exam, and putting all of that into long-term memory is no easy feat. So an important strategy for moving information from short-term or working memory into long-term memory is through rehearsal. And there are two types of rehearsal, maintenance and elaborative. So with maintenance, you keep information in working memory by repeating it to yourself. For example, repeating a phone number that someone told you until you can write it down is an example of maintenance rehearsal. This may or may not find a way to get put into long-term memory, and it's usually not as effective as elaborative rehearsal. Elaborative rehearsal, on the other hand, is keeping information in working memory by associating it with something else you already know. So elaborative rehearsal is where you will associate new information with what you just brought in. Some name games are designated to capitalize on this. Another example is when you learn new information in a class. If you can connect it with information that you already know, then you may be more apt to remember the new information later. Basically, like we were doing with the example of the computer, while you may not know all the specific components, we are talking about in the computer, hopefully you know some of it, and by talking about information processing theory being like that, you should be able to remember the parts of information processing better later. All right, so let's take a moment to examine working memory. Pictured on the screen is a model of working memory developed by Alan Badley and some of his colleagues. In this model, working memory is made up of four parts: the central executive element, the phonological loop, the visual spatial sketchpad, and then the episodic buffer. In this model, each element plays an important role in working with information. The central executive controls attention and other resources. The phonological loop holds verbal and acoustical, which is sound information. The visual spatial sketchpad, just like it sounds, holds visual and spatial information. And then the episodic buffer is where information from the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad gets integrated with information retrieved from long-term memory. So it's all working, right? That's why it's called working memory. So remember when our metaphorical computer crashed because there was too much information coming in from input? Cognitive load is related to that idea. So this slide is called cognitive load and retaining information. There are three types of cognitive load. There is intrinsic cognitive load, and this is cognitive load that cannot be avoided. It is the amount of cognitive processing required to figure out how to do the task. So we will do this. There's no getting away from that. The extraneous load, which is the cognitive processing you use to deal with anything not related to the task, such as a crying baby or a poorly written textbook, detracts from what we're trying to accomplish. So you can imagine that. You get distracted by the baby, or you're distracted by the poorly written textbook. And then lastly, we have the germane cognitive load. And this is the good cognitive load. And this involves incorporating old information and new information to form new understanding. This is the deep processing it takes to fully understand something and make it a part of our knowledge base. So we have 3 different types of cognitive load: intrinsic, extrinsic, and germane. And the 2 goodies are intrinsic and germane, and this extrinsic cognitive load are kind of our distractors. So now we move into long-term memory. And this is where our memories are stored. As far as we know, the storage space in long-term memory is unlimited. There are, however, different types of long-term memory, and we should be aware of those. The 2 largest categories are explicit and implicit memory. With implicit memory, you don't necessarily need to think about it for it to happen. This is where things like classical and sometimes operant conditioning effects are stored. It is also where things like knowing how to drive a car, how to ride a bike, sew a button are stored, and those are called procedural memories, right? These are procedures that we remember. You know that old expression, it's just like riding a bike. It's because we really don't need to remember how to ride a bike. Once we've learned it, anytime we get on a bike, we just automatically do it. And you can think about driving a car in the same way. You probably aren't thinking about the steps that it takes to drive the car. At least I hope you're not. So we are effectively on autopilot. Implicit memory also includes priming, which is just the activation of background knowledge. So we automatically pull information from long-term memory. It's kind of priming. It's done without thought. And then we have explicit memory. So as opposed to implicit memory, you do need to consciously think about explicit memory to remember it. So things in explicit memory may be facts from this course, which would fall under the semantic memory, or it may be that time that something really funny happened, and as you think about it, you can almost close your eyes and see it happening again. This latter is an example of episodic memory. So in explicit memory, we have episodic, which are your own experiences, and semantic, which are facts and general knowledge. With implicit, or unconscious knowledge, or unconscious memory, because it's retrieved unconsciously. We have things like classical conditioning, procedural memory, and priming. So at this point, I just want to point out that this diagram is one concept of how memory works, but my concern is there is some argument about whether or not episodic memory is truly and always explicit. What I mean is we may struggle, for example, to remember what we had for breakfast and then draw up a memory of our green smoothie and our chai tea latte. But sometimes episodic memory just happens. For instance, you could have someone with PTSD who will, with no conscious effort, be back in a war situation or other traumatic event without ever trying. They're just there. So that being said, I actually prefer this conception of long-term memory. It is pretty much the same stuff, but arranged just a bit differently. So I only wanted to present this as a means of explaining that little argument about implicit and explicit memory in terms of episodic memory. So feel free to toss this particular slide out. The diagram before is the one that is followed by Woolfolk, and it's probably going to be the most useful for you in terms of the exam and the quizzes, etc. Okay, so let's review what we know about information processing. First, the information in your environment gives you signals to the sensory memory. If you pay attention to these signals, they will enter your short-term or working memory. In working memory, through either maintenance or elaborative, elaborative rehearsal is done. Elaborative rehearsal will allow you to best store information into long-term memory. Then when we remember information, which is a different process, we will pull it from long-term memory and put it back into working or short-term memory. From there, we can formulate a response or responses to events. But here's something to think about. If we all experience the same thing, would we all recount it in the exact way? What do you think? Okay. So I give you some pondering time. And while you're doing that, let me say that there are a few more things from chapter 8 that I want to cover. And those topics would be things like forgetting and decay that I will take up in chapter 9. So thanks for listening. Have a great day, great evening, and I will see you on the discussion boards. Thanks so much.